p.m. We're bringing developing news.
And the stories behind the headlines. This is Storycon. I'm Virginia Lay.
I'm Ed Lingao. Some stories we're watching this Friday weekend, May 23. President Bongbong Marcos has retained key members of his economic team amid his administration's great cabinet revamp. Among those staying are DTI's Christine Roque, Finance Chief Ralph Recto, DepDev Head Arsenio Balisacan, Budget Secretary Amena Pangandaman, and Economic Affairs Assistant Frederick Go. Executive Secretary Lucas Bersamin says other cabinet officials who filed courtesy resignations are still under review. The president also refused Bersamin's courtesy resignation.
Talking about musical chairs too for some government posts. Foreign Affairs Secretary Enrique Manalo will replace Antonio Manuel Lagdameo as the UN Permanent Representative, while DFA spokesperson Tess Lazaro will take over from Manalo effective July 31, 2025. At the DENR, Energy Secretary Rafael Lotilla replaces Tony Yulo Loizaga. Bersamin says Loizaga will take a rest, but noted underperformance on her part. At the Department of Human Settlements and Urban Development, or DSUD, Jerry Acuzar is out, while Engineer Jose Aliling is in. Acuzar is now the presidential advisor for Pasig River Development with cabinet rank. The Commission on Elections, or COMELEC, has dismissed two separate disqualification cases, one against Bagong Henerasyon party list and another against Senator-elect Erwin Tulfo, both on technical grounds. The petitions were found to be deficient in required documentation, including affidavits of service and certificates of nomination. COMELEC said BH's proclamation remains suspended until the decision becomes final, while Tulfo's case was dismissed by the 2nd Division.
President Marcos will advocate for a binding code of conduct in the South China Sea during the upcoming ASEAN summit in Malaysia. Marcos is also expected to reaffirm the country's position on the South China Sea anchored on international law. Meantime, Akbayan representatives are pushing to form a West Philippine Sea bloc in Congress. The bloc aims to push for legislation on mandatory WPS history education, July 12 West Philippine Sea Victory Day, and the creation of an institute to protect maritime resources. And joining us today, at least we're still waiting for him to come online, will be our political papa, Ronald Llamas.
We don't know.
We don't know yet.
We'll see.
Miracles happen.
You gotta stay tuned. But we always have from the Philippine Star, Editor-in-Chief, Ami Pamintuan. Hi, Ami.
Hi, happy weekend. Hinihintay lagi ni Ed.
Oh, yeah. Look at the color. Is that purple or violet?
Yan ah. Balik na ako sa color siya. Purple.
Purple. So there's more red than blue.
Okay. That's your best shot
Aba.
at being a fashion critic. Ayan na. Sige na nga, mag-politics na lang tayo, Ed. Okay. Ito na. The first culling of the cabinet.
Yes.
Alam na natin who's in, who's out. Let's take a quick look. First off, si E.S. Bersamin, Lucas Bersamin, is staying. That was the first, if I understood correctly, yun yung first na first resignation that President Marcos
Kasi siya nag-announce eh.
Oo nga, syempre, you have to retain you, di ba? Siya yung nag-announce nga ng changes. So, E.S. Bersamin is retained. Tapos yung economic team is retained.
I wonder though how he is as a manager kasi justice ng Supreme Court versus being a manager. I mean, those are two different things.
Very different things. Being a justice of the law and arbiter of the law versus managing a huge bureaucracy.
Day-to-day affairs of the president and Malacanang.
Pero administrator ng judiciary ang court, ang Supreme Court.
Yeah, well, pero
medyo mahirap-hirap nga yung trabaho
that's what
yun,
you have. That's why you have a court administrator to do that
Yeah.
But when the justices kasi when they iba na yung palo ng justices versus yung court administrator. But anyway, yeah, that's also a good point.
Let's take a look. Meron ding the whole economic team was retained. We're talking about starting with DTI Secretary Cristina Aldeguer Roque, Finance Secretary Ralph Recto, Budget Secretary Amena Pangandaman,
DepDev used to be NEDA.
DepDev Secretary
Arsenio
Balisacan, and Special Assistant to the President on Economic Affairs, Frederick Go. Let's take a listen at E.S. Bersamin here.
As far as the cabinet or the number of resignations, yung mga nag-resign, courtesy resignation, as of the time that we started this press conference, there have already been about 52 who have submitted. Dahil sa kahalagahan ng economic team sa buhay ng ating bansa, yan po ang unang inaksyonan ng ating Pangulo. After careful evaluation, the President decided to retain the following members of the Cabinet. Take note. Una, ang ating DTI Secretary Maria Cristina A. Roque. Retain. Pangalawa, ang ating Department of Finance Secretary Ralph G. Recto. Pangatlo, ang ating DepDev Secretary Arsenio M. Balisacan. Pang-apat, ang ating DBM Secretary Amena F. Pangandaman. At ang panlima, ang ating SAPEA Secretary Frederick Go.
So that should make the business groups happy. Makati Business Club, Philippine Chamber of Commerce and Industry, both voicing support.
What's the signaling here? In toto, retain ng buong economic team.
The signaling is
That he's happy with,
economic strategy remains on track, I guess. As we keep saying dito, of course, the investors and the business community, they hate seeing any uncertainty, right? And before pa in-announce na the whole economic team is being retained, these business groups have already said na the speedier this cabinet shakeup is completed, the better for the country because I mean, it's important. They know who they're talking to, right? Because we're talking about billions of dollars in contracts yan eh. Conspicuously absent though in the economic team is DA, right? Hindi ko alam if
okay.
I don't know what the signaling is there. What does that mean?
I kind of love kasi DA with the other sector, the
like the SWD, the DPWH, frontline agency.
Yeah, the frontline agencies.
Sa bagay, you could also look at it that way. Pero yeah, for me as well, medyo conspicuous na hindi na mention yung DA this time around, especially with all the issue over the price of rice. Pero
actually, Bok, yung frontline agencies, yun ang wala pa dito sa listahan.
Because
wala pang mention kung ano mangyayari. So, yun ang ano.
Maaga pa naman eh. Baka hanggang mamayang alas 7 may mga bagong announcement.
Yeah, that's true. Kasi you're looking at agriculture, health, social welfare. Di ba? From bigas to ayuda.
Yeah. Exactly.
And DepEd, and eskwelahan at libro. Diba? And of course, DOTR.
Saka yung ginagawang issue kay President Marcos, peace and order.
Peace and order. So that's
DILG yun.
DND, DILG, and
The DILG
NSC.
yun.
So,
DILG siya.
And to ordinary people who yung mga nasa survey, I suppose yun ang titignan nila kung
Oo.
Saka yung OSG na ayaw idepensa
OSG.
ng gobyerno doon sa pag-aresto kay President Duterte, tignan natin.
I will tell you what's interesting though. Si DOE Energy Secretary Rafael Popolotilla is taking over DENR Secretary Tony Yulo Loizaga. And that's interesting because what are you signaling here? To repeat your question, Bok, right? So typically energy and environment, hindi naman magkaaway, but there's always a little bit of a tension there. May tension there, right? Because of their slightly the competing mandates, right?
Saan mo bibigay yung taya mo doon sa pagpaparami ng mahuhugot mo na energy sources o yung pagpapalago
or to save,
mo
tama, or whether to
ng
save the
puno.
environment. I find it interesting kasi si Secretary Lotilla has a background in energy policy talaga, di ba? Dati he was president of PSAM as well. And he's also a law professor. So he's also an attorney, law professor at UP, was a law professor at UP. So it's interesting to me that now he's been told to take over DNR instead.
So
Tapos
yung kay Lizaga kaya is fallout ng
Health reason
international
daw.
controversy over, I'm sorry, Ami?
Yun ang sabi, health reason.
Health
She
reasons?
resigned for health reasons.
Talaga? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. So,
Yan
that's
ang
another
sabi.
aspect pala. That was funny kasi there was a lot of international feedback over what happened with Masungi.
Yes.
Rightly or wrongly, it hit international headlines eh.
Yes.
So I'm wondering lang also if that also had any
Could
any
be,
bearing.
because that put the Philippines in a very bad light,
Yeah.
right? It made it sound like we're not trying to conserve this eco park, right? Tsaka,
Pwede namang di ba? If you are sick of the job, you can resign for health reasons.
pwede,
Sabi talaga.
ganun. Hindi pala physically sick, you're sick of, ganun. Pero inamit naman ni E.S. Bersamin na papahingahin muna si Sec Loizaga, potentially mabigyan din ng position later on, but read between the lines na lang. The fact that she was let go. Hindi rin siya ganun katagal in the position yet, right?
Who takes over
Hinihintay ko si
Populatila's position?
Ed, may balita ka ba dun sa poverty alleviation czar?
Talaga namang hinanap mo. Talaga namang hinanap mo.
Nag-resign din siya. And then, he tendered his resignation. Natanggap ba?
Yeah, well, I think everybody's waiting for the results with
Sabi ni-
bated breath.
Sabi ni ES, yung mga ma-retain, most of them already know that they will be retained. So baka tawagan na lang natin yung mga
Say na.
Say na.
Tawagan niyo
They
si
have to
Gadon.
announce, no? They have to
the ones
announce.
that are being retained, alam na daw nila, more or less.
Yeah. But medyo bad taste naman if they're the ones to announce na I'm being retained.
Oo nga. Oo. Kaya kailangan mga manggaling sa malaking, baka sa
Pero
PCO.
subukan lang natin. Si Larry Gadon, patawagan natin.
Pwede.
Sasagot naman yun.
Pwede, oo.
Oo.
If he hasn't heard by
Meron isang
now,
advisor daw na hindi nag-resign, yung advisor for Muslim Affairs. But this was last night, ha? Ewan ko, baka ngayong umaga nag-resign na.
si Presidential Legal Advisor ba? Nag-resign na?
Ba't naman pag-resign si Enrile?
Yes, he did.
He did na? Okay. Kasi
Yeah, siya.
he's one of the last
Kahapon pa.
he's one of the last ones we were waiting for, 'di ba?
Nag-resign siya kagabi. Nag-issue, merong may mga compilation kami. He resigned.
Pero parang awkward naman na the palace fires
100-year-old.
101-year-old
Hindi naman daw personal, Bok. It's a clean slate, right?
Yeah.
I'm just saying. That does feel awkward,
It does. Coming
Hindi,
back to you.
gagamitin mong basihan naman yung
Health
Wala
reasons.
naman diyang age requirement.
Akala ko health reasons eh.
Oo. Di ba?
Coming-
Faster daw. And ano yung mga hinihingi ni President Marcos from his team. Yun ang pangako ng economic team. That they will deliver results faster. Yun yung statement nila ngayon.
Coming back to your point about DOE, who's taking over is
Yeah, who's taking over?
Yusek Sharon
Garin.
Garin. And what's interesting...
Sharon Garin?
Garin.
Oo.
Garin?
What's
Congresswoman?
interesting...
OIC.
Correct. What's interesting here as well
Yusek.
is hindi siya acting secretary. She's being made OIC.
Okay.
So
OIC,
there's
yeah.
also a signaling there. Why wasn't she made acting secretary right away?
But
right?
what's her background? What's her background?
She's
as,
good. She's
energy?
Yes.
Talaga?
She has a long history in energy policy as well. And ang alam ko kay Sharon Garin is she's an advocate of nuclear energy,
this work?
actually. So is it
okay.
nuclear a huge item on the president's agenda? Right.
You're talking about the modular nuclear reactors?
Well, whatever methodology they use, it's they're certainly looking into reviving nuclear energy, as is a lot of other countries in Asia, right? So but that's part of it. Curious lang ako why they didn't just name her as acting secretary and instead said she's OIC in the meantime.
Mahal mo si Larry Gadon.
Oh, naman. You wish. And then
Full of energy naman siya.
And then lastly, we've got D-Sud, pero this is pretty straightforward. Na si Jerry Acuzar was named Presidential Advisor for Pasig River Development, and replacing him is an Undersecretary, that's Jose Aliling, who is already well known in the building development, infrastructure sector. So no, I don't think that's coming as a huge surprise. I think it's fair to say at this point, yung pinakamalaking surprise was really DENR and DFA as well. And you were right in pointing out that Lagdameo here.
We have nga pala 2 Lagdameos.
Oo.
2 Antonio Lagdameos in the cabinet.
Yes. Hindi sa Malacanang yan.
Oh, Anton,
yung isa yan.
the son, siya yung special assistant to the president.
Special assistant.
The father is the one who is our
In
permanent
the UN.
representative in the UN, and the father is the one who's being replaced
Correct.
by. No?
So this is Antonio Manuel Lagdameo, and he's the permanent representative to the UN. And he's, I guess, been voicing his desire to retire because he is a bit more senior. And matagal na raw niya sinasabi he wanted to retire, so this was his opportunity to do so. But the thing is that E.S. Bersamin pointed out that it's a crucial time for the Philippines because we are trying to campaign for a seat at the UN Security Council, the UN non-permanent seat at the UN Security Council, which is why he can't let go of the UN permanent position. It has to be to someone very senior, and ito na nga, we know that it's going to DFA Secretary Enrique Manalo.
Nagulat ako na una, parang si Manalo is going to become
Yeah,
sacked.
at first glance, right? So, but when he explained it like that, naintindihan ko na
Well,
because
first, parehong first names Antonio.
because-
Manuel and Antonio Ernesto.
so this is like the mayor, the father, and again, the reason DFA Sec is Manalo is moving there is because it's a critical time for the Philippines as it campaigns for the UN Security Council seat.
Okay.
Pero this changeover is happening July 31 pa or thereabouts once each has been sworn in.
Okay, let's do it.
Moving on, we have to talk about the other big story today, which is another incident out in the West Philippine Sea. We have
Bombahan muli.
our first live guest in the studio. We got Ray Powell. He's a maritime security expert and director of the Sea Light Koreanaut Center for National Security Innovation at Stanford University. Welcome back to Storycon. Thanks for
Hello, sir.
dropping by.
I thought it was a commercial break. I came in, I was talking. I don't know if I just stepped off. It's like, these guys are really rude. They're just talking to each other. They're not even. So.
Just a small thing to say that we are actually live on air on bantering and just ad-libbing everything. Yeah,
Important safety tip.
exactly. So, CCG, Chinese Coast Guard vessel 21-559, side-swiping and water cannoning a BFAR research vessel
Yep.
on Wednesday. Actually,
Or Thursday. And before saying this is the first time that they're doing this to them at Sandy Cay, in the Sandy Cay area.
Or even around Pagasa.
Oh, Pagasa Island, yeah.
It is a
So
first.
is it an escalation already?
Well, I mean, certainly in some ways, right? So the thing about Pagasa, of course, is it is got a territorial sea.
Yeah.
Now, internationally, that's a little ambiguous because internationally, no one has ever ruled on who owns Pagasa, right? Even though, of course, it has a civilian population and it's, the Philippines has occupied it for 5 decades, nobody's ever made a ruling. And of course, not only does China claim it, but Vietnam and Taiwan
Correct.
also
Yeah.
claim it. So the international players have all been sort of, muted about how they sort of interpret that. But from a Philippine perspective, of course, this is very much within the territorial sea of Pagasa. And I would argue, from the international perspective, even from an American perspective, I would say it's time to go ahead and say, at the very least, like the Senkakus, like we say about the Senkakus, the Philippines has administrative control over Pagasa unambiguously.
you say it's time to what? Time for the U.S. to send in troops, boots on the ground.
okay,
Is that what
so
you're saying? Because you wrote an article
I
about
did.
this many years ago, saying
Yeah, a
it's
couple years
time for
ago.
the U.S. to.
So that sounds very, very militant. What actually I'm arguing for is we have a program of medical civic action program. So you can basically fly in a plane load of doctors and engineers, fix schools, extract teeth, do all the kinds of things to help the civilian population there. It's still a military mission, but it's a humanitarian military mission. And I think that's a good sort of first step toward just sort of, on the one hand, letting the China know that you can't tell us that we can't visit our friends. And second of all, just to say, we are in this together, and the Filipinos on Pagasa matter to the United States. And I think it's time.
Isn't that going to escalate things even further? Isn't that going to poke the bear even more?
Look, everything provokes China, right? I mean, what doesn't provoke China? So
Fair point.
At some point, so there's a question of, are you going, so everything you do is going to elicit a response. They're going to issue these overwrought Global Times articles that talk about how the Philippines is today they're claiming that the Datu Sandai rammed the
Correct.
Chinese ship,
Yes,
right?
That's their side of the statement.
That's what they do, right? So I don't think we can worry about all the things they're going to say.
Fair point.
You're saying humanitarian mission to Pagasa Island. That's also a fair point. But whatever you call it, so long as you see U.S. camouflage and boots on Pagasa Island, that's how it's going to be seen visually as well. And
I think people should see U.S. camouflage and boots, frankly. I mean, we are treaty allies. There are Filipinos living on Pagasa Island. They fall within the scope of the alliance. They fall within the scope of the Mutual Defense Treaty. People should understand, China should understand, that the Mutual Defense Treaty extends to Filipinos living on Pagasa Island. Mm-hmm. They're not there with guns, but they are there to represent the military in a humanitarian way. That's what I argue for.
Mm. But this is
Mr. Powell, this is a direct assault on a civilian ship. That's a BFAR ship. Are there any specific provisions under our treaty with the U.S. that covers these types of incidents?
Yeah, so the clarifications the United States have been issuing over the last couple of years have said that all public vessels are covered under the Mutual Defense Treaty. So that is a public vessel.
Yeah, that's a great point. It is civilian, but it is a public vessel,
is.
right? And the extra significance there is it's a civilian vessel, and the first time that it's happened in the sandbars in Pagasa.
Yes.
Which leads us to wonder, is Pagasa becoming the new Ayungin?
Well, I mean, obviously it's a much different situation. It would be hard. So for a long time, China's approach to Ayungin is, let's just keep the, quote, construction materials away from that ship so that eventually it will slide into the ocean, right? The civilian population of Pagasa is not going to slide into the ocean. Now, could they at some point decide to essentially lay siege to Pagasa? That would be a really extreme step, and that would be really bordering on invocation of the Mutual Defense Treaty. They essentially starved the Teresa Magbanwa out of Escoda Shoal. The problem from the Philippine side is that they correctly said you can always just sail home, which is true, right? But the civilian population at Pagasa, that is their home, right? So I don't see it getting to that point.
Okay.
But is Pagasa Island considered by the U.S. to be part of the Mutual Defense Treaty's coverage? I know about the discussion about public vessels in the West Philippine Sea. Those are covered. But hasn't the U.S. avoided recognizing our claim to this practice because it does not want to go into sovereignty issues?
This is true. The U.S. has avoided all sovereignty questions. From the time when I was a young analyst looking at the Spratly Archipelago all the way back in the 80s, the U.S. has avoided this thing, as has almost the entire international community, because they don't want
to take a position.
Exactly. If they say, okay, if we recognize this one, then say Vietnam says, well, you have to recognize these, and all of it's sort of this snowball effect. And so that made sense for a long time because we were trying to maintain the status quo. But newsflash, we're on a news program. The status quo has changed. And so I think it's time for our policy to grow up and recognize the fact that, China is exploiting our ambiguity. And so maybe a little more clarity is called for.
But that would...
and now, Mr. Powell, we now have the arbitral award. That's based on an international treaty.
That's true.
How should that change the equation?
The arbitral award, though, doesn't address territorial sovereignty. So with specific reference to Pagasa and its territorial sea, all the arbitral award says is Pagasa has one, but it doesn't say whom it belongs to. So China could say, well, and of course China ignores the entire arbitral award, but Vietnam could say, well, that's our territorial sea. And the arbitral award was intentionally silent on territorial sovereignty issues. It tried to stay narrowly focused on the question of maritime law.
But before the U.S. can move forward to start putting boots on the ground on Pag-asa Island, it has to first of all start recognizing Philippine sovereignty over Pag-asa Island.
Which
I
brings
mean,
us back to the initial problem,
Yeah.
which is that they don't take positions.
Right.
And initially, or at least back then, they were operating under the banner of this is all for international free
navigation.
international
navigation, sure.
freedom of navigation. That's it.
And that has been the U.S. emphasis for decades. I think that under the current circumstances, though, and again, I don't think the U.S. necessarily has to go to full recognition of sovereignty. It can go to the question of administrative control, which is, again, how it treats the Senkakus issue. It doesn't mention who has sovereignty over the Senkakus, only that Japan has administrative control. And that might be a nice half measure to sort of square the circle, if you will. And I do think Pag-asa is unique in the Spratly Archipelago. There is not another civilian population in the entire Spratly Archipelago. The Philippines, again, has been there for 5 decades. Now, Taiwan would argue that they got there a little bit sneakily, but there was no violence. They didn't take it. And I think at this point to just settle down and say, look, let's just face reality. The Philippines is not leaving Pag-asa. There's a civilian population there. We're going to support our friends.
Mm-hmm.
So acknowledging one country's administrative ownership of it is different from acknowledging sovereignty?
Yeah, that would be the specific example of the Senkakus. So quiet on the question of ultimate sovereignty. It's sort of it's a half measure, saying administrative control clearly belongs to this country. And frankly,
similar to the treatment of Taiwan.
Similar to the treatment of the Senkakus.
Just Senkaku, okay.
Yeah, I mean, Taiwan is a whole mess in and of itself. And I would say, of course, there's no civilian population on the Senkakus, but there is one on Pag-asa.
Mm-hmm. Going back to Sandy Cay.
Mr. Powell, I want to go back to the arbitral award that covers our maritime entitlements. Are you saying because the territorial dispute has not been settled, that China can still go to our seas and invoke their territorial claim, while we are saying we have been awarded sovereign rights and our maritime entitlements have been defined under an international law? We cannot tell them, please stay away, to stay out of our, let's say, EEC, for example.
Well, I think the Philippines can absolutely say that. The issue is what has international law spoken on with regard to territory? And the answer is, in the Spratly Archipelago, nothing. And Pag-asa lies just outside the exclusive economic zone of the Philippines, or anyone's exclusive economic zone. So it is literally outside all exclusive economic zones. That wouldn't necessarily apply to a territorial sea. And if there were a ruling on sovereignty over Pag-asa favoring the Philippines, then they would absolutely be in the Philippines territorial sea. And I think it's perfectly fine for the Philippines to say, you are in our territorial sea because we live here and we claim sovereignty. The problem that the Philippines faces specific to Pag-asa is the international courts have been silent up until now because nobody's really brought it to them yet.
Mm-hmm. Going back to Sandy Cay, for a long time it appeared that China and the Philippines were treading very carefully on Sandy Cay because of the 2002 Declaration of Conduct. Nobody's supposed to take over any uninhabited island or feature. But in the past few months, we've been seeing more activity there. You've seen China raise a flag there.
Just last month,
as well.
Last
month.
And it was broadcast by their state media,
by
which
Chinese
is quite
state
odd.
media, and declaring that it is theirs on Chinese state media, and of course that basically means that it's the Chinese government. And then you have the water cannoning for the first time off Sandy Cay. So are we headed somewhere we don't want to go?
What's the signaling there?
Okay, so I think first we have to understand what the significance of Sandy Cay is. So you have the Philippines on what's technically under the arbitral award is technically a rock, which does have territory, so they can claim a territorial sea.
Nautical miles.
Meanwhile, China is nearby on Subi Reef, which is technically, under the arbitral award, a low tide elevation, earning no territorial sea. It is not territory. What is territory is Sandy Cay. And so China, I think, maybe, even though it says it doesn't care about the arbitral award and claims the entire South China Sea anyway, this may be something of just sort of a gambit over a period of time to eventually say, well, here we have something that's authentically above water at high tide. Therefore, this is territory, and now our position is even stronger under our lawfare campaign.
So what should the Philippines do with regard to Sandy Cay? I mean, without violating, for example, the 2002 Declaration of Conduct. Should the Philippines just put an outpost there or what?
Who was telling us we should build a hut?
That was us.
Oh, that was you. That was you.
Well,
one of
those container vans that you see in construction sites, just dump it there.
Have a structure on there, a permanent structure on there.
One of the weird things about the Declaration of Conduct is that China has violated almost everything in there except this one thing. And that is no putting new structures on previously uninhabited features, right? And so I'm not, at this point, expecting China to try to inhabit Sandy Cay. And I think President Marcos has very assiduously tried to stay within the bounds of international law, and I think for his relationships with ASEAN and being able to sort of claim the moral high ground, I don't think the Philippines will put a structure on Sandy Cay. So we will probably continue to see these back and forth demonstrations. And it's very tempting to say, let's resolve this thing, but it's hard to see like any resolution in the future. I think you're in for a long contest. And so you are going to have more of these kinds of conversations over a long period of time.
Any possibility, for example, of another ship running aground?
Accidentally, of course.
It's what, three nautical miles away from Pag-asa Island.
It ran out of fuel.
Yeah.
It's an old boat. We like to buy these old boats.
One of the funny things
was
during that entire Escoda Shoal thing, China kept saying that the Teresa McBanwa was out there on a quasi-grounding because it dropped anchor. So China is like highly attuned to the possibility of another grounding.
They were hypersensitive.
But we can't afford that. That's new. That's
right.
new boat.
We don't have any more old ones. Which one are we going to ground?
You had the one that sank before the Sinkex. That was that one.
Okay. So you're I don't know.
I'm not suggesting.
I'm not suggesting it.
President Marcos is going to the ASEAN meeting, he's going to for the code of conduct. Any word of caution, because there are concerns that it might reinforce China's status quo, the current status quo, occupied artificial islands. Any word of caution to the Philippines?
I would say my biggest word of caution is don't imagine there will ever be a code of conduct. We have been talking about a code of conduct almost my entire adult life. And we're not really seriously any closer because the major issues are all still outstanding.
How much more a binding code of conduct?
Right, because when we talk about binding, who's going to bind it?
Yeah.
Right? Eventually there has to be some authority, and there is zero chance that China is ever going to agree that the authority is not China.
The authority is us. We self-police, right? That's the whole point.
Who's we?
All the member countries.
Well, they have their own police.
ASEAN.
China's a bigger police force.
Okay.
I just, remember, this is a China-ASEAN agreement. So China would have to sign this agreement, right? If you want to exclude China and come up with an ASEAN-only code of conduct, not that that will ever happen. But no, I am a code of conduct pessimist.
Non-believer?
I just call me a pessimist.
Okay. So you don't think it's ever going to happen? It's ever going to come to fruition?
No. I don't.
Okay. It doesn't. I mean, I don't know that there's been much progress on it either. We've just celebrated, 20 years of the declaration? 23 years now.
I feel like I read the same book every year. The new ASEAN chair comes in, they say, we're going to make progress on the code of conduct. Almost nothing happens, and then another ASEAN chair comes in. And again, the problem is that in the end, the issues are just so intractable. And frankly, the Philippines is not going to get a better deal from a China-ASEAN code of conduct than it's already got under the arbitral award. And the arbitral award, I mean, that is sort of the gold standard for what protects the Philippines right now.
So if not a permanent, if not a binding code of conduct, what's the next best option here? I mean,
frankly,
do we even continue talking, and to what end?
I think, so you never stop talking, right? I mean, nobody will ever say stop talking. I just think you have to keep your expectations in check and understand that in the end, what the Philippines is looking at is a long-term resistance to occupation, right? So you've heard me say before, this is a maritime occupation of the West Philippine Sea by a hostile imperial power. The thing that defeats an occupation is time and, frankly, the imperial power getting tired and going home because it just doesn't want to fight anymore. China is not close to that now, so you have to think this is going to be a long-term effort.
Right. Ray, you also published a few articles. I don't know if we could show it on the big screen about Scarborough and talking about China's expanding presence in the Scarborough Shoal. You're saying that it's used, it really expanded its forces out there, increased its forces blocking the Philippine access.
This is
to
a great graphic. Our data visualization team put this together, and it really shows that in the last 12 months, the Philippine Coast Guard is no longer, or BFAR, no longer able to approach Scarborough Shoal. It's being kept out by an ever-expanding phalanx of China Coast Guard and maritime militia ships.
What's going on there? What's the end game here?
Well, of course, well, part of it is, of course, China is just asserting its control. Now, it's had control effectively since 2012,
correct.
but the Philippines was able at least to approach the shoal.
Exactly.
A very interesting thing happened, and this is the other article. A very interesting thing happened in the middle of last year, which is China put out a big report saying, we did an environmental study of Scarborough Shoal and found that the condition is excellent, right? Now, nobody outside of China really believes that, because what we know and what we've documented on the website is that China has been aggressively harvesting giant clams at Scarborough Shoal for years. At the same time as China, and by the way, giant clam harvesting is extremely destructive to reefs. So the first way that they would do it is they would drag propellers through the reef and churn up the reef so they could get it. And what they like is the clam shell, because they make it into jewelry and statuettes and things. They're very valuable on the Chinese market. The other thing that they do is they blast high pressure water down into the reef to sort of try to stir up the reef, and that sediment then goes out and kills other parts of the reef. So China has been doing this. We've documented how they've done it, and what we are saying is the other thing that happened at the same time China put out the report saying the reef was excellent, all the giant clam vessels have disappeared. And middle of last year, June of last year, they all left, and they haven't been back. Is it because there are no more giant clam shells? Is it because giant clam shells are not valuable anymore? I would say no. The most logical explanation, the preponderance of the evidence, suggests that the condition of the reef is actually quite bad. And they have successfully gone a long way toward destroying the ecosystem of Scarborough Shoal, and they now recognize it, and now they're going to try to give it time to heal.
The image that you're showing right now, could we put it back? What's the color coding here?
Okay, so this particular one is the Philippine Coast Guard and BFAR vessels. So but the yellow spots are where it's been most active, then sort of the purple spots, and then the blue spots. And so what you can see is Scarborough Shoal there in the middle, and there's about a 25 or 30 nautical mile exclusion zone that the Philippine ships are no longer able to get into Scarborough Shoal. And this is very different from the previous 12-month period, where those vessels were routinely able to get right up to the edge of the shoal.
And again, coming back to your story, the whole point of blocking access is to prevent anyone from seeing the destruction?
I think that's part of it. I do think that they very much want to keep anyone out that might actually be able to disprove the truth of what's actually going on there. I think the other thing, of course, is they've just decided to make
take full control.
They're going to take full control, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
Can't we see it over
And can we
satellite?
file an environmental case? Can we file an environmental case against China?
Yeah.
I think that's probably, in fact, I believe that's very much under consideration here in Manila. And to your question, actually, if you look at, again, back on the Sea Light website, we have an article that I wrote. Basically, it says that China is lying about the condition of Scarborough Shoal.
Oh, yeah, that's right. That's the other article you published.
And in that article, we show some satellite images that show plumes where these giant clam vessels are blasting almost certainly blasting the reef and uncovering.
Oh no, that's the research vessel. Yeah.
But uncovering the reef, and so and we've also show how these giant clam articles from Scarborough Shoal have been very much on the market even after China said that it was banning the trade in giant clams. So what they've done is they've sort of used a loophole which says, well, we didn't say giant clam shell, we just said giant clam.
Giant clams.
So, which is good if you're a living giant clam, maybe, but if you are a reef that has giant clam shell deep within it, then that's a bad thing.
Terribly destructive for
Yes.
you. But could that be what's happening out at the sandbars in Sandy Cay in Pagasa? Because remember the BFAR vessels that went there also noted down some
Crushed
Crushed
corals.
coral.
a lot of crushed corals and a lot of coral reef destruction under the waters.
So I think, so as far as giant clam, I don't know that we know that they've been doing giant clam harvesting at Pagasa. So now the crushed coral dumping, what we suspect may be happening is they're just trying to artificially
Increase.
raise the top of the cays so that they are above water at high tide, so that they can
It
say
becomes
later
a-
on, look, this is a real island or a
Right.
real rock under
Right.
international law. So therefore, should get a territorial sea, and therefore, whenever we do decide to put somebody out there, that has its own weight behind it. So.
You just said it isn't likely that they're going to defy that convention in the Declaration of Conduct, right? Which is to put a permanent structure.
So far, they have stayed away from doing that. Although they have a very, very carefully worded. When they call out the DOC, so it says that previously inhabited features cannot be occupied, right? With the Sierra Madre out at Ayungin Shoal, China has always said that that doesn't count as real inhabitation, right? So they've never given the Philippines credit for inhabiting Ayungin Shoal. Meanwhile, when they had fishing huts at Mischief Reef, them turning that into a huge port and airfields and anti-ship missiles, that's A-OK.
Right.
So in other words, if you stick another vessel there in Sandy Cay, that's also not inhabiting an uninhabited area.
I would
if you use their
that China has a white-hot passion about grounding vessels. They just really, really
You
don't
would
like
think,
that.
right? You would think they would be
If we file an
hypersensitive.
environmental case and we win it, will it be binding?
Well, again, so in some ways, the other arbitral award should be binding, but if China
Yes.
says no, then the question then becomes who does what. So, right. So ultimately,
Yes.
and so this is you have law, you have a prosecutor, but you have no sheriff to put somebody in jail. That's what all of this sort of lacks. Is there is not the sheriff who actually goes out and says to China, "We're putting you in jail." So.
in a
Well,
jail
the
big enough.
international community is issuing statements of condemnation. What else can other countries do?
So I think that the other thing that other countries are doing is assisting the Philippines in building their capacity. And I think that's actually really important because ultimately the thing that's going to deter China, frankly, is hard power. And so, again, this goes back to this question of a long-term resistance.
Right.
Anyone wishing for a short-term solution, I don't think that there are any of those that really end that well. So you have to think in terms, this is a long-term resistance, this is imperial occupation. We have to start pushing out our timeline and say, where do we want to be in 25, 30 years?
It's got to be part of the toolkit
Yeah,
of long-term strategy.
exactly.
Okay, we're going to have to leave that there. Thank you so much for your time and your insights today. Maritime security expert and director of the Sealight Gordian Knot Center for National Security Innovation at Stanford University, Ray Powell.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Powell.
You are watching Storycon on One News. We just need to take a very quick break. We'll be right back. Stay with us.
And we got developing news in the stories behind the headlines. Welcome back to Storycon, the Story Conference. I'm Ed Lingao.
I'm Regina Lay, and still with us, Ami Bamintuan of the Philippine Star.
And in spirit,
Sandali na lang, ha? May nag-resign pang isa, ha?
Ano?
Bureau of Internal Revenue, courtesy resignation. Siguro reaction dun sa
Commissioner,
kasi may
what's
mga
it-
nagtatawag, including
Oo.
yung VACC, kailangan daw pati yung mga may problemang agency like PAGCOR, Customs, Bureau of Immigration, mag-resign din daw.
So si Commissioner Lumagi to.
Yeah,
Tama?
courtesy resignation.
Ah, okay.
Although
Yeah.
hindi naman hinihingi ng di ba? Yung mga bureau hindi.
Oo. So,
Eh,
that makes sense.
Pero sabi ng Volunteers Against Crime and Corruption, kung gusto mo mag-crackdown sa corruption,
What about
isama yung mga troubled agencies nga
Oo.
daw.
Like customs and I mean, these have always...
immigration, PAGCOR, yung mga POGO, di ba?
Yung sa immigration kasi kakapalit lang din eh. Remember I think it's Commissioner Joel Viado now who replaced the one who under whose tenure Alice Guo got away, right? Sino yung before?
Yeah.
Si Commissioner...
I don't remember.
I also don't remember his name, Mike, pardon me, pero yeah, so immigration, customs, but these have always been the tricky, the very difficult agencies to run eh, di ba?
Yeah. Saka tingnan natin kung hinihintay namin nga kung magre-react ang Malacanang sa ganyang mga suggestion, baka maubos na yung gobyerno, no?
Actually, yeah. Hindi mo na kailangan isabay-sabay lahat yan. Kasi isabay-sabay mo lahat yan. Kung sino man nag-i-screen, mabibingwang eh. Kasi ito pa lang, 40 sila mahigit eh.
Reboot eh, di ba? Tingnan natin.
52 ang
52.
nag-tender.
Oh.
52 ang nag-tender. And,
Kapag weekend, ang dami lagi nangyayari, di ba?
ay, nako. Ang interesting thing dyan is ayaw i-disclose kung sino yung members ng review team.
Yeah.
ES Bersamin was
Baka
asked
walang
about
team
it.
talaga.
If there's a screening committee, no? Meron
talaga.
Hindi natin alam kung meron eh.
Meron daw talaga, sabi ni ES Bersamin, but he just can't disclose the people, but he assures the
Sino
public
kaya yun?
that they're of high caliber daw. They're
Siyempre, alam mo sabihin niya, alam sabihin niya mga lobat yung mga screening team.
but we don't know. That's the big question. We don't know who's
High
in the
cal
screening
yan, high
team.
cal yan. Siyempre, sabihin niya.
High caliber.
High cal, hindi lobat.
Saka gusto syempre malaman ng mga tao kung meron mga political advisors, di ba?
Yes.
Di ba, kino-consider ba yung politics dito dahil it's an offshoot of what happened in the elections eh.
Yes.
Gusto rin malaman ng mga tao kung may say ang mga politiko dyan.
And it's a big chunk of it also is public perception. Kasi maliban sa elections, or also looking at the surveys eh. And surveys and elections, they're not necessarily because of what you've done, but more of how people view what you have or
Correct.
have not done.
It's perception. Perception in this case is reality.
Unfortunately, I'm not saying that's the ideal. Of course, it's not the ideal.
Katulad ng sinasabi ni Attorney Lasierda yesterday, there are some economic indicators that actually got better in the last several months. Like inflation has gone down, yung food prices, labor I think as well has slightly improved. There are some economic indicators, pero
Yung
the
bigas, meron na 20 pesos.
the perception is still generally negative. Hindi daw nag-reflect sa surveys, right? Which is true. We saw
Kasi
that.
itong ibang binabanggit na tong realignments eh. Merong mga marites lang naman na si ganitong power block ang nag-influence ng selection. Merong mga ganon, kaya maganda sana kung i-disclose Saka pinakikinggan pa ba yung mga kamag-anak, hindi ba? Gusto rin malaman yun ng mga, of course, hindi naman siguro aaminin, no? Kung meron naman.
But it's suffice to say.
May malaking dartboard yan sa
open daw to Senate presidency.
Sino?
Si Senator Amy Marcos.
Oh, wow.
She's among the contenders.
For SP.
Wow.
Dumadami sa Senate presidency. Titignan
May
natin.
jockeying happening in the Senate, huh? Well, that
Yes,
would be an interesting dynamic kung ang Senate President ay si Senator Amy Marcos.
Yes.
Paano kaya yun?
Although, isa pang ewan ko kung dark horse, pati daw si Bam Aquino is also among those. Hindi minority leader, Senate President.
Masyado namang
Among the marites siya na,
nakuha
within
sila
the
ng
week.
dalawang pwesto. Umambisyon na naman.
Ganyan ka.
Uy, she's not saying naman na si Bam mismo nag-ambisyon.
I know.
These are just murmurings.
But these are probably supporters.
You never know. Bali ba may support sa
It's
Senate?
supposed to be an independent chamber, di ba?
Oo.
Pwede siyang compromise,
Yeah, but
considering the
yan yung supposed to be.
income composition, di ba?
Okay, we have to let it go now. Next week is another big week. We've got the Senate convening as an impeachment court and reading of the reading of the charges now. So we gotta prepare for that. Thank you so much for joining Storycon today. This week as well, Ami Pamituan, Editor-in-Chief of the Philippine Star. Join us again Monday, 4 p.m. for Storycon. I'm Regina Lay.
I'm Ed Lingao. We are One News, all sides, all the time.